Okay, we're talking about the race for space today. The actual race for space began way before Kennedy took office. It actually took place on October 4th of 1957. October 4th of 1957. Does any one of our intelligent AP US History 2 students know what occurred on October 4th, 1957 that started the race for space? Very good, yes. Delaney and Hunter, the Soviet Union made history with the launching of the world's first satellite, Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1. Now, although this was a very impressive first, it scared Americans to death because the Cold War was at its height and the military significance of Russians in space scared the United States to death. So, to scramble up for lost time, it was the United States government in 1958 that created what we know as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA. So because of the successes of the Soviets on October 4th, 1957, the race for space against the Soviet Union was on, and to scramble to make up for lost time, the United States government created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, in 1958. Now, NASA has had several programs over the past many, many years. The Space Shuttle probably is something you're most familiar with. But the very first program that NASA ever developed was called the Mercury Project. The Mercury Project. Okay, the Mercury Project. Now, it even got worse for the United States because on April 12th of 1961, a cosmonaut, that would be an astronaut from Russia, a cosmonaut by the name of Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth. So on April 12th, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth. Now this was very, very impressive because his trip into space lasted 1 hour and 48 minutes, and you can compare that to some of our firsts, and we'll see how they go. But it lasted 1 hour and 48 minutes, and he circled about 203 miles above the Earth, making one rotation around. So his trip lasted 1 hour and 48 minutes, and he circled some 203 miles above the Earth. Now this really gave the Soviet Union a 2-0 lead in this race for space. And because of this, on the outside, President Kennedy wholeheartedly supported this newly formed Mercury Project after he took office. On the outside, he really did understand the importance of it. But really, historians will tell you that he was concerned about the amount of money that we were going to be spending on it. So he supported it on the outside, but in the inside, he was concerned about the financial responsibility. But he did support the Mercury Project after he took office, and this is when he proclaimed that Americans would land on the moon and return safely back to Earth by the end of the decade. And people thought he was crazy to think that early in his administration. So when he took office, President Kennedy wholeheartedly supported the newly formed Mercury Project, although inside of his mind he was thinking, boy, can we afford this? And it was at that point, early in his presidency, that he boldly proclaimed that Americans would land on the moon and safely return by the end of the decade. People thought he was nuts, but he made that prediction. Well, this whole race for space for the United States is going to start with Project Mercury, which will take us to our next subtopic then, which is the Mercury Space Program. And we'll tell you how this whole thing came about, the Mercury Space Program. Now, the Mercury Space Program started during the latter stages of Eisenhower's administration. Kennedy inherited this. And it started in 1959. And what happened in 1959 is NASA asked the Department of Defense for a list of military test pilots to be considered for astronaut training. Okay? So NASA talks to the Department of Defense and says, hey, talk to all the branches of your military and let's see if we can give us a list of military test pilots that you guys think might be able to be astronauts. Okay? And when the Department of Defense responded to NASA, they gave them 508 names. 508 names were given to NASA by the Department of Defense as possible pilots to be considered for astronaut training. And we'll get into a numbers game here. Of those 508 names that NASA was given by the Department of Defense, they considered 473 of those 508 names. So NASA gets a list of 508 pilots that the Department of Defense think might be good astronauts, and right away the Defense Department trims that down to 473. Now, these 473 possibilities were going to be evaluated first of all on age and on height. They had to be less than 40 years old, and they could be no taller than 5'11". So when they looked at those 473 possibilities, they had to be less than 40 years of age and be no taller than 5'11". So they took those 473 possibilities, they looked at age and height, and they narrowed it down from 473 to 110. So they dropped her down to 110 based solely on age and height. Well, of that 110, they picked 69 pilots to go to Washington, D.C. to be briefed. Okay, basically interviewed. Okay? So of these 110 pilots that they have cut down to at this point, they picked 69 of those to go to Washington, D.C. for a briefing. Basically, they're interviewed and kind of put to the test to see if they wanted to be part of the Mercury space program. Because really they hadn't been asked yet if they wanted to, they were just on the list. Well, of that 69 pilots that were interviewed and tested in Washington, D.C., 6 were too tall. They must have measured them wrong the first time. And 16 said, I'm not interested. So that left them with 47. So after the interviews in Washington, D.C., they determined that 6 of those 69 were too tall, and 16 simply declined the opportunity, which left them with 47. Well, they looked at those 47 and they picked 32 to report to New Mexico for physical examinations. So they took those 47 that they interviewed in Washington, D.C., and they picked 32 of those 47 to go to New Mexico for physical examinations. And basically these physical examinations in New Mexico were going to determine how each of these 32 men handled physical stress. That was kind of the test. So they were given stress evaluations and psychological testing for about a week. Okay, about a week of stress evaluations and psychological testings. Well, of those 32 that were tested for stress and psychologically tested in New Mexico, excuse me, they picked 7. They picked 7. And these 7 would become the nation's first astronauts. So it went from how many at the start? 508 all the way down to 7. Now these were the 3 things they were chosen for, why they got to be the 7th. They were chosen for their experience. They were chosen for their skill. And they were chosen for their physical fitness. To NASA, these 3 attributes, experience, skill, and physical fitness, were a unique combination of the right stuff. And there actually is a movie out called The Right Stuff that's about this entire program. Okay? So to NASA, these 3 attributes of experience, skill, and physical fitness were a unique combination of the right stuff. Now, these 7 men would become known in American history as the Mercury 7 astronauts. The Mercury 7 astronauts. And they had some unique things about them. First of all, they're going to be kind of revered as new American heroes. They made the cut from 508 to 7. So they're going to be revered as a new breed of American heroes in the early 1960s, which made them very popular with the public. Okay? They're almost like rock stars or celebrities at that time, because everybody was enamored by these Mercury 7 astronauts and what they were going to be doing to get us even in the race for space. So they became very popular with the public and almost like celebrities. The cool thing was they really developed a lot of camaraderie among themselves. They became very, very, very close in this training that they're going to take for the space program. So a great deal of camaraderie developed between the original Mercury 7 astronauts. And they each gave their capsule that they would fly in a nickname that would end in the number 7 to show their membership in the first class of astronauts. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So all of their capsules, all of their flights are going to have a nickname, and each is going to end in the number 7. Now, these men came from 3 different branches of the military, and we'll tell you who they are. Okay? So you got your paper in front of you, you can kind of get a look at what these guys look like. The United States Air Force supplied 3 of the 7 Mercury astronauts. United States Air Force. And all of these astronauts, if you're interested, and this is maybe the proudest thing in this room I own, is I have 6 of the 7 on the wall by Emily there. 6 of the 7. From the United States Air Force came Captain Gordon Cooper Jr. Gordon Cooper Jr. came from the United States Air Force. He was 34 years old when selected. Gordon Cooper Jr. The second member of the United States Air Force that made the Mercury 7 was Captain Donald Deke Slayton. Captain Donald Deke Slayton. He was 35 years old at the time of his selection. Captain Donald Deke Slayton. The third and final member of the United States Air Force that served as a Mercury 7 astronaut was Captain Virgil Gus Grissom. And he was 33 years old at the time of his selection. Captain Virgil Gus Grissom. So for the United States Air Force, Gordon Cooper Jr., Donald Deke Slayton, and Virgil Gus Grissom, all captains in the United States Air Force, and evidently very good pilots. Hey, the United States Navy supplied 3 of the 7 Mercury astronauts. Lieutenant Alan Shepard Jr. He was age 35 when selected to be one of the astronauts. Alan Shepard Jr. Also from the United States Navy was Lieutenant Scott Carpenter. Scott Carpenter was 33 years old when he was selected. And the final member of the Mercury 7 astronauts from the United States Navy was Lieutenant Walter Sharara Jr., who was 36 years old at the time of his selection. So representing the United States Navy in the Mercury 7 astronaut program will be Lieutenant Alan Shepard Jr., Lieutenant Scott Carpenter, and Lieutenant Walter Sharara Jr. The final member of the Mercury 7 is probably the best known, and he came from the United States Marine Corps, and that was Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn Jr. Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn Jr., who was the eldest member of Mercury 7, being 38 years old when he was selected. So the United States Marine Corps was represented by Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn Jr., who was the eldest member of the Mercury 7 at the age of 38. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the Mercury flight achievements and tell you who went first, second, third, fourth, etc., and the significance of those flights and what happened to those particular astronauts. And we're going to start on May 5th, 1961 with Freedom 7. Freedom 7. May 5th, 1961, Freedom 7. Now kids, this was a suborbital flight, which means what? Suborbital.
It's only going to go half around.
Or not even that.
Oh.
It's not going to make an orbit. It's going to be a suborbital flight, so it's not going to make an orbit, okay? It's going to go up and come down. Now the man that was commanded to be the first American in space was Alan Shepard Jr. Alan Shepard Jr. is selected to become the first American in space. Wasn't a spectacular flight. He rocketed about 117 miles into space and landed 15 minutes later. Okay? So Alan Shepard Jr. became the first American in space. He rocketed 117 miles into space and landed 15 minutes later. Now the capsule he was in weighed about 3,000 pounds. And he reached a top speed of 5,180 miles per hour. Freedom 7 weighed approximately 3,000 pounds and reached a top speed of 5,180 miles per hour. Now, this is a little bit inappropriate, but it's history. Prior to the launch of Freedom 7, Alan Shepard Jr. was incredibly nervous. I mean, what were the chances of him coming back alive? Probably not real good. I mean, this was a new deal, okay? And so, just before he launched, he stated publicly on the air, "Please, dear God, don't let me F up." But he didn't abbreviate. He gave the full Monty. That's what he said prior to going up. He was scared to death. This quote went down in aviation history as Shepard's prayer. True story. That's what he said. He was very, very concerned. And that's what his quote was, and it went down in aviation history as Shepard's prayer. What happened to Alan Shepard after his famous Freedom 7 flight, in which he became the first American in space? He actually was grounded from space flight from 1963 to 1969. And you don't have to write all this down, kiddos, just kind of listen. Because of an ear disorder. But in 1971, he did command Apollo 14, which was the third. We had Mercury, then Gemini, and then Apollo. Okay, as far as this race for space went. And he did command Apollo 14, which was man's third successful moon landing. Third. Okay, so he went from the first guy in space to being in America's third moon landing. Quite a distance in time. Now, kind of interesting, when he was on the moon, Shepard used a 6-iron and he struck 2 golf balls, driving them, according to him, miles and miles. And when we go to the National Air and Space Museum, if that's your thing, you can see his 6-iron that he hit when he was on the surface of the moon. It's kind of cool. Well, he eventually resigned from the Navy in 1974. He had reached the rank of Rear Admiral and unfortunately died of leukemia at the age of 74. And his wife of 53 years died 5 weeks later, and both were cremated and their ashes were committed to the sea. Kind of a cool deal. But he hit a golf ball, 2 actually, girls, on the moon. Okay, that'll take us to our next flight, which occurred on July 21st of 1961. July 21st of 1961. And this one was entitled Liberty Bell 7. Liberty Bell 7. And it also was a suborbital flight. In other words, it did not go around the Earth. And it was commanded by Virgil Gus Grissom. So he's going to become the second American in space. And his was very similar to Shepard's. He rocketed 118 miles into space and landed shortly afterwards. So it was a very similar flight to Freedom 7. Now, a little bit of a glitch though for Grissom. When his spacecraft landed in the ocean, an emergency hatch accidentally opened and it filled with water. And he almost drowned. It sank and Grissom was rescued by a helicopter above the water, no capsule. It had sunk to the bottom of the ocean. And to be honest with you, I don't know for sure, but I think maybe 8 or 10 years ago, they actually brought that thing back up, and they are preparing to refurbish that to put it in the National Land and Space Museum, but it's not at that point yet. Okay? Now, Grissom was a very good astronaut. He also flew in the Gemini project, which was next for Mercury, and he also was selected to fly in the first Apollo mission, Apollo 1. Apollo 1. So he also flew in the Gemini project and was scheduled to fly in the Apollo 1 mission. Unfortunately, on January 27, 1967, a fire swept through the command module during the test while it was on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy, and all 3 astronauts, including Gus Grissom, perished inside the capsule, burned to death. That's why I don't have a 7th signature there, because his signature is worth thousands of dollars, because he didn't sign a lot. Okay? So he was killed in Apollo 1 when a fire swept through the command module during the test on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy. We'll talk about that when we get a little farther into history. Okay, the third flight is the most famous, February 20th, 1962. February 20th of 1962. And this one was commanded by John Glenn Jr., and it was an orbital flight. Orbital flight. So by commanding Friendship 7 on February 20th, 1962, John Glenn Jr. becomes the first American to orbit the Earth. And he circled the Earth 3 times in a little less than 5 hours. So he kind of outdid Yuri Gagarin, who only circled once. So again, February 20th, 1962, aboard Friendship 7, which was commanded by John Glenn Jr., he becomes the first American to orbit the Earth, circling the Earth 3 times in less than 5 hours.